minutes. So yeah, I would like to welcome in Scott and Jadu. So Jadu, now it's up to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sangas. And it is really great pleasure to be discussing on this very interesting, fascinating book by uh, Scott R. Stroud. The book in India, it is, I have gone through the book from page one to the last, and it begins with intellectual biography of B.R. Ambedkar, the evolution pragmatism in India. So, if somebody would read the evolution of pragmatism in India, that is also fine. But I would, begin with this. Uh, Let me, contextualize. Scott is a researcher and specializes. Uh, uh, Scott researches and specializes in the area of pragmatism, and his earlier work and the books, to be mentioned here. John Dewey and the Artful Life. This is his first book. The second book is Kant and the Promise of Rhetoric. And his research area includes uh, uh, rhetoric, communication, philosophy, experience, American pragmatism. Why I'm saying this, this is a background to understand Scott. Otherwise, one would not actually, fall. One would actually face difficult to, understand. So Scott also, does different kind of interpretation, taking from this all, concept that I said, whether it is rhetoric, communication, philosophy, pragmatism, and so on. So therefore, this book, uh, you know, to be read in this way. So uh, when I read this book, it is for me it is important to actually lay out this to understand the evolution of pragmatism in India. Is an intellectual biography of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. In the first, I would say it is a fascinating research work to understand pragmatism, as Scott put it. It is a well argumentative book. There are so much to learn from the book in terms of method, in terms of interpretation, and the method that Scott employed. So, to me, there are two ways to understand or unpack this book. One is that Scott employed is there are two kind of resources, rather I would say. One is tracing the classroom teaching and how it has impacted Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, or the courses that been taught by John Dewey, and the courses that Ambedkar took. So from that classroom lecture, the class lecture, uh, where Scott derive or basically you know uh, lay out his interpretation first. And second thing is that uh, the text Ambedkar read, cited, annotated, paraphrased, quoted, and so on. That how one can read those texts that Ambedkar cited, John Dewey, and so on. So to understand the methodological part of the text, at least to me, I would say one need to how Scott rely on this. One is the classroom lecture, and the second is the textual interpretation, how Ambedkar annotated, cited, and quoted, and so on and so forth. So in which Ambedkar has a deeper engagement with John Dewey. Not only his lecture in 1916, 1915, but up to writing Buddha or Karl Marx, or Buddha and his Dhamma. So, so therefore, how Ambedkar formulated and reformulated, or or has written whatever that Ambedkar has written, whether it is a book review. That book review, it is there in the very second chapter of the book, a book by Russell, where Ambedkar wrote a very brilliant critical book, critical review. That is first time that we have seen in the academic discussion Scott has actually brought out. Otherwise, this was almost a neglected kind of Ambedkar's short writing. Then whether it is a submission to the Southborough Committee, where again Ambedkar paraphrased, annotated, and cited John Dewey in different ways, or it is Annihilation of Caste, where we all have read probably that where again John Dewey comes into the book in very different way, and Ambedkar is so brilliantly annotated and put it his own context. Or whether it is Ambedkar conversion to Buddhism, his 1936 speech, What Way Emancipation, or 22 Vows in 1956. Right. So these all books, just to name few, and this is what largely Scott dealt in the book. Further to understand in terms of methodological point, Scott also spent so much time and in the book, because his discipline somewhere talk about the rhetoric, persuasion, and communication and so on. So therefore Scott calls rhetor, Ambedkar as a rhetor, as a rhetoric, and it is to again understand through the speech that Ambedkar gives, or the emphasis Ambedkar gives in different writing, or talking to many Dalit audience in different time and space, the way he emphasizes, the way he speaks, that bring another attention to Scott to think about rhetoric, persuasion, communication, and so on. So therefore it gives a different meaning to the text and the philosophy altogether. So these are few methodological way to understand the book. And the book that I have mentioned, the book or the speeches that I have mentioned, Scott elaborately dealt on this area. So therefore, in a very fast, I would say the book has written in the lens of Deweyan view, or pragmatism. First point. So to then just to say a few lines about the idea of pragmatism. Pragmatism started in America in the 19th and the 20th century, when Ambedkar was also there in the very beginning of the 20th century. So the philosopher like Charles Sandel, Fires, William James, John Dewey, Richard Rorty, and many others. It has also impacted European society. In the recent time, we have seen in the critical school tradition also philosophers like Jürgen Habermas, Axel Honneth, and many others also have some kind of impact and influence from this philosophy. So among them, one of the influential philosopher was John Dewey, and the teacher of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in 1910s, 1915, 1916. So, according to the Oxford reference, they have point or define pragmatism in this way. It is a philosophical approach that that assess the truth of meaning of theories or belief in terms of success of their practical application. To put it in very simple terms, it is to think about to solve a problem in terms of practicability, or in a very sensible way, rather than in a very dogmatic or in a fixed way. So just to think about Ambedkar, when you try to think about pragmatism, it is a very, very simplistic term. One can actually go beyond that. So but for that matter, any philosophy could share similar meaning to solve any problem. It is not merely pragmatism that only deals with to solve the problem, but any philosophy for that matter. So, but the question is what is the distinctiveness of a pragmatist philosopher, or pragmatism that could differ from any other approach that everybody are willing to take and solve any problem. So So therefore, what is the distinctive, pragmatic philosophy, and how Dr. B.R. Ambedkar learned from his teacher John Dewey? How Dr. B.R. Ambedkar employed those approach, term, phrase, philosophy to his social political context. This book gives a historical detail of evolution of pragmatism in India through Ambedkar philosophy and the politics. Uh, Pragmatism is a philosophical approach to understand any other political or philosophical enterprises, practical enterprises. Uh, Scott reading Scott is reading Ambedkar philosophy or politics through pragmatism and Deweyan approach. I would say very emphatically, it is a Deweyan reading of Ambedkar. So that could be a difference. That could be also a question that Scott would take it. So therefore, the first difference could be this. So therefore, question one can raise that can we really capture Ambedkar's thought through pragmatism, or how Ambedkar qualified to be a pragmatist philosopher? Shall we read Ambedkar through a lens of pragmatism? For example, there are enormous discussion on annihilation of caste, for that matter. How one can read annihilation of caste, or what way emancipation, or 22 vows? These all writing and speeches, according to me at least, go beyond the idea of pragmatism. Somewhere, Scott deals with this question, but not adequately came out, I would say. What I would say rather, this all reference that the all, whether it is annihilation of caste, what emancipation, or any other writing 22 vows that so much discussion happened in the book. So I would say it creates emancipatory force. There are also so much discussion on the idea of force when Scott discussing about the speeches, discussing about different kind of emphasis in different time and context. He also focuses on the idea called force and what kind of force it is. Whether there are also discussion on the violence, there are also discussion on the force, and what is this force that Ambedkar one can read in Ambedkar. So I would rather call it as emancipatory force, and this all texts, when I say go beyond the idea called the pragmatism, I would rather even call it as emancipatory ideal. It is not just limit to the pragmatic approach of Ambedkar thought or Ambedkar philosophy. So I have written something while doing my PhD. Given there is also reference to Scott here. How much time I have, Sanghas?
You can conclude actually, Jadu.
Okay. So I'm coming to the conclusion part. Yes. So what I have written, I would definitely read in this context. Several scholars argue that Ambedkar was influenced by liberal pragmatist John Dewey. Here I partly agree with this formulation. I would agree that Ambedkar was not dogmatic or static. One can then say pragmatist. Yes, in some sense he is. Just calling him a pragmatist, experimentalist, or strategic would limit his larger emancipatory vision. So when I say experimentalist, strategic, reference goes to Kia Mitra, Teltumde, and others. Okay, so even Scott somewhere agree with the idea of revolutionary pragmatism, but also disagree with this. Let me quote his earlier writing. Scott, as Scott Stewart quoted, Ambedkar's pragmatism is revolutionary in that it seeks major changes that affects social justice. it is not revolutionary in the way that is typically understood by those extending in Karl Marx's general orientation to social change. Unquote. This is by Scott. So I need not to again refer to other people, whether it is Kadam, Gillard or Mukherjee. These people also written on pragmatism. But this is one of the very full-fledged book on idea on pragmatism by Scott. So last point. So while reading this book, I enjoy reading because I like philosophy. I also felt there are so much discussion on when you go towards the last chapter. There are so much discussion between idea on realization, idea of individual idea of personality. So then it is very philosophically deeper. So I did really enjoy that part. Also, the first chapter of the book, where it is very distinctive method, I would say, to trace that how much impact that Ambedkar had while attending all the lectures. That is also a question for Scott to answer, that how one can only rely on those classroom lecture, and even all the references I have gone through to say that these are the impact on B.R. Ambedkar, right? So I also felt irritation of reading excessive use of John Dewey. I felt that it is not merely an intellectual biography of B.R. Ambedkar, but also a philosophical treatise on John Dewey. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaidu. Now I would request Dr. Scott to present his book.
All right, well, thank you, Sangarsh, and thank you, Professor Jadu. Your summary and your engagement with the book was awesome. And, a lot of people, have good thoughts or bad thoughts about the book, but it's clear they haven't read it. You have read it. So thank you, sir, for putting in the time. It's not an easy read. It launched right alongside of Akash Rator's book, and his reads beautifully. Mine really goes into detail, and I think the readability sometimes gets sacrificed. But it is a good book, I think, but I'm biased. Let me share my slides. You should see in a second some pictures that are prettier than my ugly face. And I'll talk for about 15, 20 minutes, give some themes, and then, we can all talk together. That might be the more useful, rambling than me. So let's see. You should see my PowerPoint. Sangarsh, perhaps come on your mic if you do not see this. But anyway, you should see the covers of the books. And as Professor Jadu said, there's a American edition or European edition. And then there's the HarperCollins edition, which is much easier to buy in India. So make sure you find the right one for your market. And you notice that HarperCollins added that they changed the subtitle to an intellectual biography of B.R. Ambedkar because they wanted people to conceptualize the book. I like the boring Chicago one a touch better because it's more academic and specific, but this is the decision for the marketers. But it is in many ways an account of Ambedkar's intellectual development. And I start where a lot of people start. A lot of people mention that Ambedkar knew Dewey and was influenced by Dewey. And as Professor Jadu has said, you have people like Mukherjee's wonderful one article analysis. You have Kadam's book where he has one chapter that talks a little bit about Dewey and holds up Dewey next to Ambedkar and says these must be the similarities. And so a lot of people have noticed that Ambedkar and Dewey, have this kind of intersecting storyline. I came to this project in 2014 as a Dewey scholar. I had heard of Ambedkar long before. And Martha Nussbaum mentioned his name to me in 2004 when she knew I was working on John Dewey. But, I kind of ignored it for 10 years. And so when I discovered Ambedkar and read for the first time Annihilation of Caste in 2014, I just knew I had to write on this because, in many ways, Ambedkar's philosophy was the philosophy I always wanted to squeeze out of John Dewey's philosophy. So at any rate, I looked into everyone that had written on this, and everyone from Zeliot to folks like Mukherjee or Maitra, they mentioned it. Chris Queen mentions it in an article. They always point to this famous letter that he wrote to Savita in 1952, where Ambedkar says, "I owe my whole intellectual life to Dewey." And, this is a perplexing letter because Ambedkar's philosophy does not look exactly like Dewey's. So, this is hyperbole or something that is complex enough to require interpretation. So at any rate, this is the challenge. How do you get deeper into the story? No one got deeper into the story. Everyone mentioned that many people influenced Ambedkar, or Dewey was one of those people, and then they move on. But what do you do if you're like me and you want to know more details about that relationship? Or if you're like me and want to place Ambedkar in relation to Dewey's philosophy, not just talk about Ambedkar as a philosopher that has no connection to anyone else, just absolutely sui generis or new. So how do you do this? And so that's the question I set to answer. And really it's a combination of two questions. And Jadoo has done a good job kind of talking about one and then talking about the other. One is a very historical question. Okay, and that's what, the book really gets into detail about, especially in the first half, which is exactly how did Ambedkar encounter John Dewey in the class or in the books? How did he use him in specific speeches, in this line or that argument of his speech? So the really detailed historical relationship between Dewey, and that relationship's going to involve things that Ambedkar liked in Dewey's philosophy, things that he disliked, right? Because that's something, we often overlook. Someone could influence you by being, the counter to what you're about. Say something in some way that you think is wrong, and then you say it even more strongly in the opposite way. So think about that historical story. How did John Dewey and Ambedkar interact and, influence each other, perhaps? Then there's a larger question, and this is what a lot of the critics of my book get hung up on. I think there's a value, especially in the West, especially among academics that I meet at my conferences in America, to talking about Ambedkar as a pragmatist. Because if you just talk about Ambedkar as an Indian thinker, what class do we put him in? He'll get jammed into the Indian philosophy class, but a lot of universities don't even have that in their westernized disciplines. So, I'm a pragmatist. I study John Dewey primarily, and I see Ambedkar in relation to that. Other people see Ambedkar in relation to other touchstones, his law career, his political activities, or his Buddhism. So I wanted to make sure by the end of this book, I gave a nice account of Ambedkar as a pragmatist, if you wanted to give that account of him. Now, of course, people are going to write the majority of books not mentioning Dewey for more than one line. And that's fine. Do it. Okay? Write all the books you want on Ambedkar as a Buddhist or as a politician or as a Dalit or as an Indian. I don't care. And that's the neat thing about Ambedkar's story. You can put him under all those labels and pull out different facts or emphasize different constellations of his very complex and nuanced history. So by the end of my book, as Jadoo has mentioned, I get that high altitude view. What does this pragmatism look like if we were to say what's different about his pragmatism from Dewey's? So there's those two stories going on in my book, very complex, detailed, fact-based historical accounting. And then there's that larger level. If we wanted to talk about him as part of this pragmatist tradition that evolves and changes and differs, how would we do it? Now, this project has driven me to India something like 5 or 6 times. And every time I'm in India, I try to get deeper into the mind of Ambedkar. I try to get deeper into the movement that extends beyond Ambedkar's death. So I've tried to meet everyone that's related to Ambedkar, that's involved in the related political, educational struggles going forward. I've tried to find every archive that holds his notes, his books, his notebooks, his letters, private collections like my good friend Vijay Sarwade. Mr. Sarwade has been so helpful for my project. And, everyone I've met in India is so nice and so impassioned about Ambedkar's history and his future. And so, I've said this various places, but I'll say it again. This is one of those projects that has changed my life and my scholarship. Writing this book on Dewey or this article on Dewey, that hasn't really redirected my life or scholarship, but discovering Ambedkar has. And so I'm eternally grateful to so many of my great friends in India. And over the course of these, archival dives, I've gotten beyond Boz. I've tried to get beyond the writings we have of Ambedkar and try to see the decisions he makes when he's writing these books, when he's wrestling with how to enunciate his arguments and his philosophies over various times. And I've tried to get into the struggle he has had with Dewey's thought, that struggle particularly. So let's go back to a book I found early on at Siddharth College in their collection. And, I missed it the first time I was there. And the second time I went to Siddharth, I always go to Siddharth College. It's kind of a pilgrimage for me. I love, seeing the chair where Ambedkar sat when he drafted parts of the Constitution and thought his great thoughts. And so in their special collection room, they have a pile of books by John Dewey. And one of them is called Influence of Darwin on Philosophy. Now, this book, you should see pictures of it here on the screen. This book is, we know for a fact he bought it while he was a student at Columbia. You see his, annotations in the inside cover there, 1914 October. And that's right when, you'll see in a second, when he took his first Dewey class. In the back of this book was jammed a scrap piece of paper. And this is what I missed the first time. And then the second time I found it. And you see it's a scrap piece of paper because it's got an ink blot. He loved his ink pens, right? You see him practicing out his signature. Now Ambedkar is a human like us. We forget this. We think of him as a great leader, a great thinker, someone who's behind great texts. But he was a human. He dreamed, he practiced, he doodled. And what's he doodling here in 1914? His signature. He's trying to figure out how to say it. This is not the signature you'll see on the Constitution, because like him, he develops as a person, as a personality over his life. And you also see at least 2 spots here, maybe 3, him doodling John Dewey's name. So this little note, it doesn't seem of note, was very, it really hit home to me that this Ambedkar guy that I know from like Annihilation of Caste is a human. And he has this history behind him. He has this story of development. And there's a particularly interesting story that has to be told about that connection to Dewey, because here he's doodling Dewey's names. Now, another piece I came across, and this is something that no one in India or America has ever found or put together before, and I think it's absolutely important. So part of my challenge was to get into the classrooms of Dewey. I find it absolutely, shocking that everyone has mentioned all of these teachers Ambedkar had, but no one has any insight into what those teachers exactly taught Ambedkar, right? So, the normal way people do this is they say, he took Lasky at London School of Economics. Lasky wrote this book. That must have been what Ambedkar heard in the classroom. That assumption is problematic for a variety of reasons, right? You don't teach everything that you're writing on in a given class. Classes have different subjects. And how do we know that? If only Ambedkar had TikTok, we could see what he had for lunch every day. So one of my challenges was getting into a classroom of over 100 years ago. And so one way I tried to do that was to look at recollections from fellow students of Ambedkar. Ambedkar's famous. People remember what they did with him or said to him. Same with Dewey. So I was able to find, largely in American archives, a lot of recollections of Dewey's classrooms. Surprise, Dewey's classroom was very boring. Dewey was very boring. Ambedkar was an excellent speaker, powerful personality. Dewey was very laid back, halting in his speech, and boring. So, this is one of those interesting points. It's fascinating that Ambedkar thought so much of Dewey when so many other students would write Dewey off. So, one of the recollections I found of Dewey in his class was from Nima Adlerblum, who took Dewey over many years, 1905 to 1926 at Columbia. She was also in charge of the 1948 party in honor of Dewey's birthday. This is the celebration in New York City that Nehru attended very quickly. He drove in and gave a quick talk and then left. And so she's had a long engagement with John Dewey and his wives of the time, Alice and then Roberta. So she was a fascinating source. I came across this long audio recollection that she recorded in 1966. So many years after, her connection with Dewey and at Columbia University. And, it had stuff about Dewey being boring, which is fine. It had stuff about Dewey's Japanese and Chinese students. He attracted a lot of students from Japan and China. And this was, people know about this. Those were interesting. And then it came to a paragraph that shocked me. And I put this paragraph in full in the first chapter of my book. I give you it here in part. But this paragraph is just fascinating. And again, she doesn't mention a name, but she recalls in 1966, there was also a student from India back in her Columbia days whom I saw daily. She never mentions the name, of course. Always with a pen and paper, he was reading Dewey's articles, and they'd ponder together the many ideas. This Indian student recopied the class notes after each lecture. Whenever he read some to me, it felt as if I heard Dewey himself talking, not a single word omitted. This to me reminds me of the Savita Ambedkar recollection that Ambedkar could act out Dewey's mannerisms. I continue with Adlerblum. He also showed me his attached comments, searching for a bridge between Dewey and Buddhism. Searching for a bridge between Dewey and Buddhism. Both, he said, aim at the highest morality, but Dewey's drive for a good society might be more conducive to happiness than nirvana. In the United States, this Indian student met Dewey, who gave a new turn to his life. In infusing Dewey's conception of an idealistic democracy, he may be of some help in easing the ugly, ingrained tradition of the untouchables. Now, Nima lived with her husband, Israel, just, 5-minute walk from Columbia in 1914. You see from that letter I found below. Israel, by the way, was a student and advisee of Seligman, who was Ambedkar's formal advisor. So as I argue in the book, this has to be Ambedkar. She's remembering in 1966, way back in the 1910s at Columbia. Why? Well, I point this out in detail in the book. But, one of the things that gets me is that Dewey had no other students from India that were attached to him formally or informally that I or any other Dewey expert has ever been able to find. And two, every other Indian that was in the country at that point wasn't a Dalit and wasn't much concerned about the tradition of untouchability, right? They were all fixated, maybe rightfully so, on independence. So think about this for a moment. If this is Ambedkar, this gives us a new way to kind of think about his life, right? I mean, this indicates that, he loved the Buddhist story from 1907 when Kaluskar gave him his book. But, in this letter, we start to see what he might be up to in following out that love, that passion for Buddhism, combining Buddhism with other things that make an even more effective reading of Buddhism happen. So again, I'm very skeptical of my critics that say I'm reducing Ambedkar's Buddhism to pragmatism. They obviously haven't read to page 5 or 6 of my book where I go through this. And you see in here very clearly the kind of line I think Ambedkar is working with and that I try to explore. A combination, a bridge, a synergy between Dewey and Buddhism is what Ambedkar is after. Not a replacement of Buddhism with pragmatism or a replacement of pragmatism with Buddhism. So these kind of things tell us there's a story here and that we're ignoring something that could be explained if we just say, well, he had many teachers, and then we go on. So let's go back to our two questions again. What exactly was the historical relationship between Dewey and Ambedkar? Without speculation, let's try to find evidence that gets to the specifics of this. And then two, what is distinctive in a larger sense about Ambedkar's pragmatism? Now, a lot of folks in India don't know a lot about pragmatism. A lot of people in America don't know a lot about Ambedkar. So one of the exciting things I think about my project, and I've been speaking about this at conferences all over America, is that I get to educate Americans about Ambedkar and his thoughts. So, same for India, right? I mean, pragmatism is something that should be in the philosophical spectrum. Too many folks I talk to in India, they say, oh, political philosophy, and then they point to someone from Europe. And the pragmatists, in many ways, give an option that lies between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, people like Foucault or Habermas, etc. So pragmatism is a tradition of thinkers such as Charles Peirce, William James, John Dewey, Jane Addams. W.E.B. Du Bois was a student of William James and is included in this. So you got this large growing number of people that are connected to this, kind of diverse tradition of pragmatism. Now, one thing, if you spend 10 minutes reading any of these authors, you'll see they're not the same. They don't say the same thing. They don't agree to the same, dogmas or doctrines. So it's a very diverse crew of people. But what we mean when we call Jane Addams a pragmatist, or what we mean when we call Ambedkar a pragmatist, is a nuanced claim. Okay. So first, and this is how I defend it in the book, there's a sense where when you call someone a pragmatist, you're saying, like, look, they're part of a historical chain of influence. Okay? Now, of course, they could have other historical chains or interactions they're part of, but they're part of this chain that involves these people we call pragmatists and what they think and what they write, and they respond to that. Sometimes they extend it, sometimes they develop it, sometimes they reject it and refute it. So there's this historical story here. When we say he's a pragmatist, we put him in line with, he paid attention to Dewey's thought. He did things and sometimes rejected Dewey's thought in doing his things. He did different things because he didn't like what Dewey was up to, etc. So we have that kind of story. There's also a sense where when we talk about people as pragmatists, Jane Addams, James or Peirce, etc., that we're saying, well, there's a conceptual similarity in some of their ideas, okay, some of their methods. So for instance, the pragmatists all tend to put a high value on community in inquiry and science. So scientific community is a key thing in Peirce and James and Dewey. Community is also a politically important note, right? The idea being democracy is about how communities can get along and solve problems and elect people in some cases to help them pass, solutions in law, et cetera. So the pragmatists, almost without exclusion are democratic. And they believe in science and rationalism as key things, not as science finding out the laws of nature and then you're done. That's like religion in a different guise. But the idea of skepticism and criticism, developing ideas and making our theories and hypotheses even better. So there's a conceptual similarity there. And you see that in Ambedkar, right? When he talks about in 1938, he writes that article on, is Gandhi a Mahatma? And he says, no, because Buddha had a pragmatic view of truth and ahimsa. He starts referring to the Buddha in these kind of pragmatist terms. Well, what he's getting at there is not the historical sense that the Buddha listened to Dewey or James, but the conceptual sense that the Buddha said, the point of a theory is practical effects. Don't fall in love with the raft. Don't look at the finger when you're supposed to be looking at the moon. Don't worry about where the poison arrow came from. Worry about how to solve that problem. So the Buddha, I think Ambedkar is pointing to the idea in Buddhism that these theories have a contingent value, that they're useful towards goals of enlightenment, let's say. So notice that there is a sense where we can call the Buddha a pragmatist. It's not the same sense as saying Ambedkar was a pragmatist student of Dewey's, but it's a related sense. And so you could separate those two. You could bring them together. Okay, there's different ways to play with these kinds of senses. Now notice though, if anyone should reject the idea that a person is one label, or is one ism, or is one ist, or is one belongs to one school, it's Buddhism and it's pragmatism. Both of these forms of thought, in their most general sense, reject foundationalism. They reject essentialism, right? There is no Atman below an individual. So again, I'm always confused when people think I am reducing Ambedkar to one thing, and then they respond to this and say, no, he was a Buddhist or something. It was not one thing. There's a sense where you could say he's a Buddhist. There's a sense where you could say he was a politician. And you can tell a story about his politics in the 1920s that don't really use anything from his Buddhist period. So same for pragmatism, right? When we call him a pragmatist, we don't mean that's all he is, and that captures his essential self. Pragmatists don't believe in a fixed reality. They believe reality is impermanent and ever flowing. So when you hear me say he's a pragmatist, again, this is one way of talking about him. And as a pragmatist, I'm committed to there being many ways to talk about him. The question is, does this way of talking about him bring to the surface something that's useful and insightful, that's not just the same thing that's always been said? That's kind of my criterion. And Ambedkar has a lot of people saying the same things about him. And sometimes there's a use to that, sometimes there's not. But let's flesh out this complex thinker, and let's flesh out his relationship to Dewey. Now again, Ambedkar is an incredibly complex thinker. By my count, in English alone, he has about 5 million words in print from speeches and books. Dewey in his works, which are available in English, 8 million words. So again, be very, very skeptical when someone says Ambedkar moved beyond Dewey. Which Dewey? Dewey didn't say they were the same thing, believe the same things, teach the same things all through his life, right? So same for Ambedkar. So be very skeptical when someone concretizes the world of impermanence, including the individuals in it, and says, Ambedkar is only this, or no one should be claiming Ambedkar is one thing or is not one thing. So again, the question is usefulness. So now let me go through very quickly 3 kinds of ways to think about these stories. And then we'll talk some more and get into discussion with Jadoo and the people on the call. So, there's this, when I say what comprises Ambedkar's reception of Dewey, we can think of his courses with Dewey. We can think about his books that he had a lifelong engagement with Dewey. And then we can think about how he creatively engages some of Dewey's ideas and ideals. So let's go through each of these in turn. First, the courses. Again, so many people have said he's taking classes with Dewey, but no one knew these exact classes, right? So early on in my engagement with this, I find the Columbia Bulletins, I find at the Karmode collection in Mumbai, his transcript, and I could quickly figure out what exact courses he took from Dewey. He took 5 philosophy courses. 2 were from an opponent of of Dewey's named Montague. And William Pepperell Montague, I believe is his full name. For transcript. So, the 3 philosophy courses he finished out were all from Dewey. And they were Philosophy 231 on Dewey's psychology and Philosophy 131, 132, a whole year segment of moral and political philosophy. By the way, in my book, I proved that one of his classmates in that 1915, 1916 class was Hu Shi, the Chinese reformer and pragmatist. You can find books on pragmatism's evolution in China via Hu Shi. So, right in that same class, Dewey was giving these boring lectures, and then 2 individuals go back to China and go back to India, and do new and interesting things. So, no one's told that story of pragmatism in India, and I always thought that was a shame. You also see, if you look at the specifics of these classes, Ambedkar did not take Dewey's education class or pedagogy class at Columbia. Okay, so again, people just assume that he heard Dewey's philosophy, and Dewey's philosophy was about democracy and education and education, et cetera. No, let's get to the facts, let's get to the details. And you see what he took. He took a lot of Dewey's psychology, and he took a lot of Dewey's moral and political philosophy. Now, in that psychology class, the only real reference to education was at a very high level. The idea of our impulses are not inherently good or bad. They're not set into 3 gunas, let's say. Dewey gives a very naturalized psychology. The idea that we have these impulses, they're vague, they're undeveloped, and that morality comes, as a form of social education of these impulses. Now how do I know this, right? You see at the bottom, I've found lecture notes from that exact semester from Dewey in his very bad handwriting. So again, I encourage anyone that's interested in all of Ambedkar's teachers, find the notes from Seligman. What was he learning in Seligman's classes? Or what did Lasky lecture on that was, so revolutionary for Ambedkar's thought? Because if we don't know what he's hearing in these classes, we're just guessing at how these instructors influenced him. So on the next year class, he took 2 one-semester classes for a whole year. That's Philosophy 131, 132. These classes were incredibly important. And I found lecture notes from his classmates in that exact year, and they write notes for every day of the session, you see. And a couple of those days they were sick. So 3 of the days you see notes from Ambedkar, and so we know for a fact this is a very good, accounting of what Dewey was saying to students like Hu Shi or Ambedkar. So again, it's well and fine to say, a lot of people influenced him, but how? So here we're getting into more details, and we're able to see things that Ambedkar might be playing with in terms of rejecting or altering or echoing or even just ignoring. And you can't get into that kind of detail if you don't know what was said in those classes. So in these classes, you see, as Jadoo mentioned, the distinctions on force and energy, forces violence. You also see in March of 1916, Ambedkar goes through the liberty, equality, fraternity slogan. Or excuse me, Dewey goes through that slogan. Now, it comes up in Dewey's lectures and disappears. Now that, is a very small part of Dewey's philosophy. Dewey's pragmatism does not make a bunch of those 3 values. As you know about Ambedkar's philosophy, he makes those a central piece to his view of social democracy and even political democracy, but mainly social democracy. They're written into the preamble of the Constitution, and they're in the Buddha and his Dhamma. So, and a variety of other places. Now let's look at another aspect of Ambedkar, which is after 1916, I have found no evidence whatsoever that Dewey or Ambedkar wrote each other, tried to write each other, wanted to write each other. So it's a very interesting relationship they had, right? It was very distant and respectful. Advisor, they're always practical in function. They're not just like talking about big ideas. They're about, I need a letter of introduction in London. Or, I'm sorry, I lost my thesis because of a German U-boat. Here's the new thesis. So they're very practical. Ambedkar was a busy person. So his relationship with Dewey is in some ways surprising, in other ways not. It was very distant. But after 1916, Ambedkar had a relationship with Dewey insofar as he had an intellectual, kind of observation of Dewey constantly. So in all my trips to various places, Ambedkar's books are spread all over India. Siddharth College, Milind College, Rajgraha, Symbiosis in Pune. You've got all these catches of his books that he used to own and write in. And this is the best list I've been able to figure out, and I think this is the best list to date we have of all of Ambedkar's books that he owned that were by Dewey or about Dewey. And I can say with certainty, because I've looked through every book that Ambedkar owns, and I've looked at every mark in every book that Ambedkar owns, and there is no other modern or contemporary author, including Marx, that's as represented as John Dewey. Marx, Ambedkar had 2 books by, and they were the same book. They were a compilation of Marx, Lenin, Stalin writings or something. They're from the 40s. So of the books that survive from his collection, there's no one else that's as extensively preserved in that collection as Dewey. So, and you look at the dates of these, right? They go all the way to the 50s. So again, I'm not convinced when someone says, oh, Dewey was important at Columbia, and then Ambedkar went on and did his own thing. He was keeping tabs on what Dewey was doing all the way to the 1950s. Okay, and these books are not bare. That's another thing that I found out, right? I should have known it. All these books behind me, I don't read them all. But, who has time to read as fast as you buy? So same for Ambedkar. He was busy. And he says this much to Shastri and some of his secretaries who write this down in their recollections. But, he would get a book. He would go to the chapter that was of interest. He would underline for later use. But, he wouldn't read a book cover to cover. So a lot of his books, totally bare. No marks. Okay. The Dewey books are extensively marked. So especially Democracy and Education, he had 4 copies of that book, right? 2 of them are extensively marked. And here's, an example of his annotation scheme. I've tried my best to figure out a way to hash out the meaning. Did he mean red is something he doesn't like, or blue something he likes? And I don't think there is a set meaning like that. I think the best thing we have, Anandraj Ambedkar, I believe, was the one who told me this at Rajgraha. He was saying, Rajgraha, there was a bunch of different tables sitting around, and he had pens everywhere, and he would sit down to read over here, sometimes sit down to read over there, other times. And so in my mind, what the different colors mean is different reading sessions. So here you see 3 colors, gray, blue, and red. That means that Ambedkar read this page of Democracy and Education. This is the 1916 edition he got in London. He read it at least 3 times, and he marked it at least 3 times. So, that, not every book did he read 3 times. Not every book did he mark things 3 times. So if we want to say what books did he actually read and think about, this is kind of a material trace that helps us do that without speculation. You also see in the notes, he took note cards, right? So you also see this note from at least it's after 1949, because that's when the 2 books cited at the bottom, noted at the bottom, were published. So even in the 50s, Ambedkar's still taking notes on Dewey, engaging with Dewey's pragmatism. Now let me conclude by saying a couple of the ideas and ideals that I think Ambedkar extends or modifies or creates in this conversation with Dewey. So, and the book goes through all these in detail. So, and I again, by the end of the book, I want to give kind of a view of Ambedkar as a pragmatist. If you were like me and you want to teach a class on pragmatism and you want to include Ambedkar, how would you seamlessly do that? Well, you'd look at some of these ideals as being the themes of that view. Now, human personality. Personality was a term that Dewey loved in his early years, when Dewey was much more intrigued by Hegel. And after 1904, Dewey leaves a lot of that stuff behind, leaves those arguments, leaves those commitments, leaves a lot of those ways of talking behind. So people that write on Dewey as one philosophy, one pragmatist, doctrine, they're missing this point, right? Dewey did not argue the same things in the same way all over his life. He changed, he evolved, he left things behind. What's fascinating about Ambedkar is that Ambedkar, was intrigued by some of the early things Dewey wrote, things that Dewey did not teach in 1914 to 16, things that Dewey did not write about all those years after Ambedkar went back to India and still collected Dewey's books. So put simply, Ambedkar saw some things of value that in Dewey's works that Dewey did not always think were true or valuable. So again, be very skeptical when people say Ambedkar goes beyond Dewey's pragmatism. This is cutting too many corners. So for instance, one of the essays that Ambedkar saw as incredibly valuable from Dewey was the 1888 Ethics of Democracy essay. This is where Dewey talks about democracy as a spiritual ideal, as realizing liberty, equality, fraternity. It's one of the few spots where Dewey in print talks about liberty, equality, fraternity. Okay, and he also talks about democracy as an ideal that allows the human personality to flourish. Okay, so that's from Dewey's early period when he had a nice mustache and was interested in Hegel and idealist ways of talking. So Dewey leaves that behind after 1904 when he becomes a full-throated naturalist. But Ambedkar keeps coming back to that. In my book, I cite a speech in 1931 where Ambedkar echoes a passage out of that book in his own argument against caste. And in 1950s, like around 1954, there's a wonderful dialogue, a conversation, series of letters with V.B. Kadam, a Dalit student at London. And Ambedkar requests Kadam to get him a book by Dewey's and copy it out. I need this for work I'm doing on democracy in India. And diligent Kadam sends back something. And then Ambedkar says, that's not what I wanted. And then he gives him enough details that Kadam could find the book that he actually wanted, The Ethics of Democracy. He sends that back, and Ambedkar says, thank you, that's what I needed. So even at the last years of his life, when he's revising, his works on revolution and counter-revolution and the Buddha and his Dhamma, he still comes back to this early piece that Dewey left behind so early in his career. So again, Ambedkar didn't read all of Dewey and didn't care about all of Dewey, even if he could have read it. And Dewey couldn't teach it all in his classes, of course. So this is one of those interesting ideals that comes from early Dewey. That's there when Ambedkar talks about the battle against caste being the battle to reclaim human personality. And things like social democracy, we'll talk about some more. Things like education, but a wide sense. Dewey thought education of the whole person was key, but Dewey was still fixated on the schools. And Ambedkar, of course, widens it out to things like hostels and places for Dalits to stay, lecture series for these for untouchable students, libraries for these folks, etc. And then another theme, which is fascinating to me, is think about the reconstructive methodology of Ambedkar, right? In 1950, he says in the Mahabodhi Journal, the Buddha gave liberty to his followers to chip and chop at Buddha. What's one of the few overt quotations of John Dewey? Annihilation of Caste has two overt quotations where he mentions Dewey's names and then quotes Dewey. It has many, many portions where Ambedkar takes some phrases from Dewey and reworks them. But those two overt quotations, one of them is on reconstruction of the dead wood of society and the living wood. You take what's living for our needs and leave behind the old stuff. You don't have to just treasure something because it's Sanatan or timeless or old. So reconstruction is there in pragmatism. Reconstruction is there in Ambedkar. And Ambedkar explicitly quotes Dewey on reconstruction to justify what he's doing in Annihilation of Caste. So this reconstructive method is fascinating. And as Jadoo has said, I try to make a lot of how it flows out in his rhetoric, the choices he makes and how he speaks to this crowd or that crowd to have certain effects. And one thing I see in Ambedkar, and I didn't realize this when I first engaged him, but there's a difference. And Dewey thought that the individual was formed by society and ethics arises from society and traditions. But Ambedkar had a different kind of context, right? So some of those things in Dewey, Ambedkar couldn't support. So for instance, the idea of the individual came to a larger prominence in Ambedkar than it ever did in Dewey's philosophy. So for instance, in a 1948 book I found at Siddharth College, has no other marks in it except one, and that's on the table of contents pages, and you should see that on the slides here. And you kind of get into the mind of Ambedkar when you see what he wrote on this table of contents page, right? He scrawls out in his beautiful handwriting, what place has will and effort in the law of karma? So you see what he's wrestling with here, a tradition, a culture, a society with its philosophies that take away his ability to want to do something and to do something, his will and effort, the individual's will and effort. So, this was a real wake-up call to me that, there's certain philosophies, Hegel through Dewey, let's say, or karma through some ways of reading Indian philosophical traditions that, disable the individual's ability to do something about their life or their stature in that society. You also see this later on in his life. Now, we all know that Ambedkar took a lot of care in designing the Buddha and his Dhamma, right? The first edition, the Buddha and his Gospel, 1951, and then the second edition comes out right after he dies, comes out in 57. So we all know that this book, he exerted a lot of care on it. He was talking about the physical dimensions, how big he wanted it compared to other books on the Buddha's life. Now, I came across another book from the 1940s in Siddharth College, and this book was The Iconography of Tibetan Buddhism. Now, as you might know, the corner of every page of the Buddha and His Dhamma, first and second edition, has a mudra. Boz also has this too, has a hand gesture. Now, what was behind his decision of that mudra, right? Well, you look at this book from the 40s, and there's a section on mudras in Tibetan Buddhism, and there's two mudras, two hand gestures that have check marks from Ambedkar by them. They're Abhaya and Tarjani, and this is protection or menacing. And what's fascinating is you see here, if you know what you're looking for, you see that these are, Ambedkar is narrowing down the mudras for what he's going to use in Buddha and his Dhamma. Which one wins out? Well, maybe we remember this for every page number. It's the menacing, Tarjani. Okay. Now, he of course doesn't mean for his Buddhism to be aggressive or violent, but what he means is it's not a philosophy of pacifism. It's a philosophy that makes individuals and effort and will matter. It makes the organized collection of individuals, organize, educate, agitate. It makes the organized collection of individuals matter. So it puts things like social injustice into your face. It doesn't say, I'll just wait and next life my fate will be improved. Or maybe someone else will solve the injustice I feel. So it's an engaged philosophy. It's a social gospel. So, there's a way of looking at this in the pragmatist tradition. Now, again, people will continue to just write about Ambedkar's Buddhism on his own terms and unpack it. That's fine. They can do that. I'm not stopping them. But what I like to see is this kind of connection to the pragmatist tradition that he obviously kept tabs on through Dewey's books for all those years. And you see it come out at places in his writing if you know what you're looking for. So for instance, in Riddles in Hinduism, Ambedkar puts his pragmatism, puts the theme of all these philosophies in a great one-sentence Mahavakya. He says in Riddle 22, on Brahma and Dharma, he says, philosophy has its roots in the problem of life, and whatever theories philosophy propounds must return to society as instruments of reconstructing society. Now, of course, every philosophy thinks it's practical, right? Every philosophy wants to do something good, including Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta. That's who he's wrestling with here. But his problem is that sometimes philosophies can think they're doing something good, but it just stays in the books and scrolls. And that was his major critique of Vedanta. It saw everyone as one, but it didn't translate Atman as Brahman into actual equality in society. So Ambedkar's philosophy, Dewey's philosophy, they're unique insofar as they try to they go to extreme efforts to make their philosophy touch experience. Dewey ran a laboratory school. He wrote on education. He ran a school where he put those theories in practice and helped develop his theory. So same for Ambedkar, right? His philosophy was in many ways a schematic of what he was doing in his activism, and they're part and parcel. So there's not this division of high philosophy and then other people who put things into practice or not. So that's one of the things I think we should be emphasizing when we talk about him as a pragmatist. His philosophy was fine-tuned to be put into action, whereas other people just hoped their philosophy mattered for lived experience. So I'll finish there. We'll talk some more right now, but there's definitely a sense where the pragmatist story has a past in India insofar as Ambedkar can be conceptualized as part of that. And then there's a future. When I teach my classes, I make my American students read Ambedkar. When you all pick stuff to read in India, you can pick Dewey up, and there's an Ambedkar connection there, but there's also this other philosophical potential there. So this is one exciting thing to me. Ambedkar's story is very much alive if we can find creative new ways to apply it to our worlds. And the way I've figured out a way to make it more meaningful to me is to make it part of this pragmatist story that I've kind of grown tired of and wanted to find some new aspects to. And in Ambedkar's thought, I found this great new version of what a practical philosophy of emancipation could look like. Well, let's talk some more about this. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Scott, for excavating the relationship between Ambedkar and Devi historically. So now I would like to request if Jadoo, do you have any concluding questions or comment on Professor Scott's presentation? So that we can move quickly to Q&A session. You are unmute.
So thank you, Scott. This is just an excellent explanation on the book, and you justify what you have written, and there is also very complex persuasion coming in your lecture, right? So I have actually 3-4 pages notes, so I'm not going to skip anything. But I have some fundamental questions when you writing a book on pragmatism. Yes, it is not all total idea of John Dewey's pragmatism, and Ambedkar cannot be reduced to that idea. Uh, what I'm not yet I'm trying to understand this. When somebody would read text like Annihilation of Caste, or as you very rightly bring out this, uh, or 22 vows, or the what way emancipation. I think somewhere it is very practical. Ambedkar actually asking everyone to live Hinduism and embrace Buddhism as a to live a good life and so on. And this is not merely to Dalits but to everyone, as you at the end somewhere saying this. But uh, don't you think that this all three events and the texts and speeches are also very revolutionary in nature? When I say revolutionary, it is not limiting to something to be uh, something that one can think through idea of practicality. It is also something that also become very ideal in the life, that always one aspire to follow, aspire to to have something in their mind, in their ideal, in their life, so that it would actually follow in some point of time. So in that one definitely need to think about whether these texts are pragmatic or not. So in the sense that, because you somewhere quoted that Ambedkar was not saying to destroy Hinduism, but the annihilation of caste itself indication towards destruction of Hinduism. And the very renunciation of Hinduism is an example to that. And the 22 vows, it is also very, very revolutionary in nature. So no Hindu would accept that, except Ambedkar actually, Ambedkar is not acceptable to Hindu. So therefore, what I am trying to ask here is, it is not something, I don't know what version of, pragmatism that, one would, talk to Ambedkar, or one would define Ambedkar. But definitely, at least to me, I would say that somewhere Ambedkar goes even not Deweyan point of version of pragmatism. Probably if the larger idea of pragmatism. This is one point. And the second point, when it comes to Ambedkar, yes, of course, there is a long persuasion and influence, or reading and writing referring to John Dewey. Also, Ambedkar does different exercise for that matter. Uh, while in Colombia might have read Hegel, might have read Kant, might have read many others thinkers, because he was also into philosophy. So as we also know that he was also very, very versatile reader, right? He might have also explored those thinkers when he is writing. So one question therefore come from the book is, he talks so much about the individual. At the end of the book, you are discussing that. But at least to me, I think Ambedkar, read Kant for that matter. So therefore, Kant idea of individual, Kant idea of dignity as a philosophical thought. I'm saying, when it comes to the practical level in India, this is so challenging and a necessary idea, inevitable idea. So. In terms of a philosophical inquiry and investigation, Ambedkar must have read and thought about idea of dignity and idea of individual from other thinker uh, of that point of time. This is second. The third point that one definitely like to ask, that what about other range of thinkers when Ambedkar whether in India, particularly in India, if someone has to talk about, he refers to Buddha, Kabir, and Mahatma Phule. And the idea of education itself, there was a context in Maharashtra in the 19th century. So, and the impact of Mahatma Phule, so therefore Dalits and the lower caste people, they were so much into taking education. So, and Ambedkar, was taught by his father about, Mahatma Phule. So therefore, there is also, there is also different impact, intellectual impact, philosophical impact on Ambedkar coming from Indian tradition as well. And when it comes to the idea of spirituality, idea of self-realization, one need to also think through the way Ambedkar, socialize. Their family, Kabir Panthi, right? And there's so much spiritual, spirituality. One also need to, discuss what kind of spirituality they were, following and so on. So therefore, of course, there is an impact of, John Dewey, but while somebody writing a book, calling Ambedkar Navayana pragmatism or, Ambedkar pragmatism, one need to also take care of this all, influence and Ambedkar deeper engagement to this. So one of the, feeling while when I was reading book, it is not something that, if Ambedkar, politics and philosophy to be described through idea of pragmatism, it is not something to related to anti-caste, thinkers, because all anti-caste thinkers, have some kind of, relation, engagement, and echo with Ambedkar's idea. Rather, Ambedkar could be one of the very, sophisticated thinkers of, anti-caste tradition, or he could, elevate them to a larger level. So there is also a point that, one definitely take into the account. So there are many other points to say, but I would not, go.
Jadoo, you can conclude your questions so that
Yes.
we can move forward.
Yes.
So, Dr. Scott, you want to respond to Dr. Jadoo's question?
Sure. Yeah, Jadoo, these are great points, and yeah, this is one of the challenges you face, right? Not you, but anyone writing on Ambedkar. Do you focus on everyone you could connect to his story? All the names, all the books, all the classes, all the religious leaders or traditions, and biographies tend to do that, right? So, Gopal has a great biography, Rator has a great biography just out 2 months ago or whatever. So, but what happens when we do that, right? Everyone gets a paragraph. I think in Gopal's super long biography, Dewey gets like 2 pages and then he's done. So, you get this kind of wide, but not super deep reading. And so my book, of course, focuses on Dewey, so it goes very deep into that. And, one of these, reactions, I think, from people that just don't want that much talk about Dewey, they say, well, what about Tarde or Seligman or Bergson or what, and so my reaction to these folks is, well, feel free to write your book on that. I'll be the first one to buy it. I'll give it 5 stars on Amazon because, I want to learn about actual facts of the relationship between Seligman and Ambedkar. Okay. Now I can't go into that detail without sacrificing something on Dewey. So this is one of the challenges.
Just a minute.
Sure.
So it is not to, my question is not really that. So one can definitely, go and, talk about Marx and Ambedkar. People are doing Marx or, Gandhi. That has been a, tradition in India. So, or, somebody can write, Ambedkar and Seligman and others, Edmund Burke and others. So my question is this, how one can, suppose you are writing a book on, pragmatism. You have written a book on pragmatism. So what I mean to say that, how all this idea that, Ambedkar read, confronted, fight, and, in some way rejected, criticized, and so on. When somebody is writing a book on any theme on Ambedkar or, specializing or, focusing on particular, concept, how one can therefore, erase all these, influences and all this impact or, philosophical, philosophically that person is actually, grown. So there is definitely an influence in different way. So that is the point. Not to say that somebody would write a book on Ambedkar and Seligman or Ambedkar or Marx or any other thinker. So just to say that when somebody write even Marx or Ambedkar, how therefore has a different kind of legacy that Ambedkar has, therefore has different interpretation of Marx. That is the point.
Yeah, but I hear the same question. So writing a book on Dewey erases everyone that's not Dewey. And then that leaves me with perplexity. So I mentioned in there very painfully in the first chapter that he had all these other influences, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mentioned those names. I name names. Sometimes I point to other people doing work on Golden Visor, et cetera. So, what does it mean to not erase? That's the practical question, right? And I think what you mean is to say words about these people. And my point is the same one I just said a second ago. If I were to say a lot about Kabir, I would have to sacrifice something I'm saying about Dewey. There's trade-offs. The book can't be, not everyone can write 800 pages. You barely survived 300 pages on Dewey. So this is the challenge. And so, I try to be upfront and say, look, I'm going to talk a lot about Dewey because that's the question I want to answer. And that doesn't exclude other people's. And indeed, I try to say this, I say, look, you might see something different. I see something different about Ambedkar's Buddhism when I learn something about his engagement with Dewey. So for instance, the other question you brought up about, he did say in Annihilation, and I agree, to destroy religion. But, if you look closely, right, he said, destroy religion of rules, not religion in the sense of principles. What's he getting there? That passage in Annihilation, as I point out in chapter 3 of my book or whatever, is from Dewey and Tufts' book, Ethics, 1908. Ambedkar had 2 copies of that. Both copies have that passage underlined next to it. And, that's that passage where Dewey, in a different context, he's talking about moral theory, like Kant. He says there's rules like Kant might want to have, and then there's or the 10 Commandments. And then there's principles, flexible intellectual tools that help you with the changing world, but sometimes sacrifice specificity. So Dewey was on team principles in ethics, but he's not talking about religion. He thinks religion's all about rules. And so Ambedkar takes that simple distinction and then uses it when he says which Shastra is to be dynamited. And then he uses that in the Buddha and his Dhamma when he talks about ahimsa in the Buddha and his Dhamma, right? Buddha is said to say ahimsa is a principle, not a rule. A rule breaks you because it's so specific. A principle is flexible as a way of life. And so if you don't know about the Deweyan concept of rules versus principle, you just see what Ambedkar's saying. If you hear what he's reading in Dewey, you see Ambedkar's point. It's Ambedkar's point. But you see it as kind of a continuation and evolution of that simplistic way of putting different kinds of ethical theory in Dewey. Ambedkar's using that to talk about what he means to destroy religion. And of course, the Mandala members in 1936 did not get that distinction. They just heard destroy religion, period, destroy Hinduism, and so this is kind of the level of detail I try to get into here. And, so he wants to reconstruct. That's what he should have said about religion. He said destroy, but he really meant destroy this kind of religion. And so that reconstructive urge, don't just accept things because they're old, because people say they come from the divine. That's very much what Ambedkar's pragmatism kind of rotates around. Now, that's revolutionary. Your other question, Jadu, was about, was he revolutionary or was he practical? And I think what you're doing there is you're saying pragmatism means practical. But I would reject that distinction. I think Ambedkar was revolutionary, not in the same way Marx was. Marx said revolution happened through physical violence and force. Ambedkar, thinks the problem with caste is of mindset. Think of Dewey's psychology here. It's attitudes that engage us with people, repel us from people. And so revolution in Ambedkar's sense comes in annihilating or radically reconstructing those habits, of how we, customs at the group level, how we react to people and judge them as this caste. Oh, get away from me. You're polluting by essence. And so this is, I think, there's a sense where he's revolutionary, but he's clearly not in the way of Marx, or even at the end of his life, Satyagraha, he called the grammar of anarchy. So I'm always worried when we say pragmatism is one thing and then we reject it, what we're doing. So clearly pragmatism can be revolutionary. You just got to be specific about what you mean by revolutionary. Is it violence? Well, Dewey hated Marxism for the same reason that Ambedkar hated it in the 50s. It cut too many corners with human beings and their projects, and it couldn't create fraternity. And I think Dewey also was suspicious of Marxism in all those ways. Both figures were probably socialists when it came to economics, Dewey and Ambedkar, but they hated the Marxist political direction. Whether they got him right or not, that's a different question. But, I think there's a commonality there when it comes to the ethical critique of Marxist means for revolution.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Even I have a couple of questions and comments.
Yeah.
So, I was going through your book, so I was going through some of the keywords that you have mentioned, and it also in your title, that is rhetoric. So like still we are talking about pragmatism. So we actually are not talking about rhetorics. So you also mentioned about persuasion forces like rhetoric techniques and how Ambedkar dealing with the different people in a different way, uh, and different audience. So, in relation to the persuasive force, so my question is there a difference between rhetoric as a persuasive force or ethics of persuasion? That is one. So, as you have mentioned in your book, that Ambedkar is a pragmatist philosopher, or we can take that as. So, another comment or question is that is rhetoric an absolute initial framework to understand Ambedkar's methodology? For me, I think I hope it's not absolute. Like Ambedkar is not an absolutist way that we think, or we cannot put we bracket Ambedkar into one concepts and ideas that he proposes. So one quick actually justification, when he in a Buddha in his Dhamma he mentioned what is the source of perpetual conflict, and he said in that Buddha in his Dhamma that ascending scale of hatred and descending scale of contempt. So that's the one thing. And secondly, like when we are studying Ambedkar, I think when we are studying Ambedkar, so we actually seeing there is a methodological fallacy while studying the Ambedkar. So the fallacy is that we actually, again, I'm using the word absolute, the concepts and ideas that we are presenting, that there is a versus, like social versus political versus ethical versus. So this versus has become a very what do you call a policy while studying Ambedkar. So secondly, for example, Professor Umesh Bagade is a professor at Baba Saheb Ambedkar University, Marathwada. So in his book Ambedkar's methodology, he mentions like his methodology is first is a radical reproducibility of historical subjectivity, and second is humanized universality as an objective reconstruction. So how do we understand, or there's a methodological problem, like how to study Ambedkar in this context? So this is a couple of quick questions and comments. So I would request participants, if Professor Scott want to respond.
Yeah, and you get out of a key part of the book, something I'd never get to talk about in my talks, the rhetoric angle, right? Because a lot of people in India don't have departments of rhetoric and such, and this in the chat right now, but I just published a piece on Roundtable India because I've always wanted to be on that awesome blog. And, I wanted to say something about the rhetoric angle. But yeah, what rhetoric really is about the art of adjusting ideas to your audience and trying to adjust your audience to your ideas, persuasion. So, in the worst case, it's like lying, just to fool these people. In another worst case, Plato's worst case, it's flattery. These people want to hear this, so I'll say I stand for that, but I don't really. Now, that's not all of communication. That's not all of rhetoric. When you and I persuade people in our articles, let's say, we try to anticipate counter arguments. We put our arguments in certain ways that matters for the people that hear. And Ambedkar did that. And so that's one thing, we all kind of know he was a persuasive speaker, writer, but we don't make that a methodological commitment. And so, Sangharsh, I'm glad you bring that up because that becomes an important part of my method. I mean, my method can be comprised of two aspects. One is an attention to texts, not just names, not just isms and schools, but like texts. His argument at the beginning of Annihilation of Caste changes by the time it gets to the end. So that's why I have so many quotations from Baba Sahib in my book, because I want to do justice to what I'm pointing at in certain parts of text. And then the other thing is kind of historicization of thought. What Ambedkar thought in the 20s was different from in the 50s. And so same for Dewey. And so history of philosophy combined with rhetoric, which looks at specific speeches in many cases and why someone wrote that speech that way. So this is one thing that I thought was fascinating about Ambedkar. He says something here, he says it in a different way here. What does he believe? You know, the thing I always assumed was that a thinker has one picture in their mind of their thought, and that each speech is a shard of that. You know, and that's probably a faulty methodological assumption. You know, that Ambedkar had one thought or one theory, and that this speech gives you access to it. But that's exactly what people do, right? When they say, well, he wasn't a pragmatist. Look, he talked about Kabir. Well, you know, he didn't always talk about Kabir, and Kabir is not quoted in every article. So there's a sense that you can say, well, what's he trying to do when he talks about Kabir and Phule here and Buddha? And what's he doing over here when he uses Dewey's paragraph and reworks it into a critique of caste? And so rhetoric gives us the methodological kind of approach that says, look, he wants to use Dewey here in an implicit way to, you know, convince the Mandal members in 1936 to really be against caste, not just partially. And here he's trying to motivate people to convert to Buddhism. So of course he's going to point to this legacy of anti-caste and Buddhist thought in, you know, in some cases. And so this is kind of what rhetoric gets us to do, not just look at like a harmonization of his ideas, but look at how he has a diversity of appeals, you know, different ways of arguing some of the same things. So when he talks about what way is salvation, that's a different speech than annihilation of caste, even though they're both talking about the problems he sees with Hinduism. It's because they have different contexts, different audiences, different purposes that he wants to achieve. So, you know, we could all talk about this stuff because this is the exciting thing about Ambedkar. There's many more things to, you know, ponder over. And it's hard to capture him. He's so complex.
So if anybody, I think we are running short of time, so we can take quick questions. If anybody wants to ask a question, they can raise their hand or they can use chat box.
You know, one thing I forgot to say to Jadu's point about Columbia University, yeah, clearly Ambedkar read a lot there and was influenced by a lot of people there. The thing for me has always been, how do we know that? How do we know the specifics? So Kant, yeah, you know, you mentioned Kant, and I don't know about Columbia, but I found at Siddharth College in the student stacks a book underlined in Ambedkar's style on Kant. And so I've since given that to the archivist there, and it's now in his collection. But he, you know, so he read the first critique from Kant. He doesn't use it a lot in his writings, I think, because it's not useful for his anti-caste purposes. But, you know, he knew of Kant. And you look at the drafts behind Riddles in Hinduism. You know, he starts talking about democracy means each person is treated as an end in themselves, not means. And then he strikes that out. And then he says, fraternity is an attitude, a mental habit. You know, so I like to see that as a, you know, he knew Kant, he saw something of value in Kant, but at the end of the day, when he's editing it, the Deweyan position that our attitudes we take towards each other is much more important for social democracy than the Kantian point about the noumenal worth of each individual. But anyway, I'm glad you brought up Kant because I have a thing for Kant, and you know, he's even part of the Ambedkar story.
Sanghas, no one is asking any questions, so can I have one more?
Yeah, you can, but let us ask, let me give a chance to other people also.
Yes, definitely.
Well, Jadu, maybe you can go ahead and, you know, I'm not constrained by time. I'll talk about Ambedkar the whole day. I know you all have a time frame on this event.
No, just a kind of a reflection, what you just explained before this, you know. Ambedkar nowhere cited Kabir or nowhere cited, you know, Phule or many others, you know, host of Indian, you know, the activist thinkers or, you know, many others. So, again, using your own, you know, framework of, you know, rhetoric or, you know, speech itself is an act of, you know, conveying or, you know, communicating people. So the impact of, you know, Phule is huge in Ambedkar, right? So the impact of Kabir, he was in Ambedkar. So how one can trace that? How one can excavate those impact, those impulses that Ambedkar throughout his life he cherished those, right? So therefore that is one way to engage. It is not to say that we're not Ambedkar and Phule or Kavi. One can do that, but I'm just trying to say that when we are analyzing a philosophy or philosopher, uh, one need to definitely look at this all uh, 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 look at this all that thinkers always engage with this. This is one, and the other thing, about the idea called reconstruction. So, where do you pick up this idea called reconstruction? Yes, Ambedkar wrote this essay in 1918, the review of the book, right, Russell book. The idea of reconstruction again, play very very important role in Ambedkar. But what is to be reconstructed? When you are saying this, it is actually about the mental, it is about the habits and so on and so forth. But at the same time, when somebody try to understand reconstruction and the emancipation or the annihilation as a category, of this category somewhere, the idea of reconstruction, I'm not reducing it, just I'm trying to problematizing. It is Hinduism to be reconstructed or Hinduism to be annihilated. So therefore, emancipation lies in annihilation or renouncing of Hinduism, not the reconstruction of Hinduism, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
That's an important point, right? And I mean, that's something I think Ambedkar changes on my reading over time, right? In the 1920s, he wanted to reform Hinduism, annihilation. He wants to destroy Hinduism as rules, but he said Hinduism as principles. If you open up the priesthood, etc., might work. And he points to the Upanishads or Sikhism as paths. But on the cover of Annihilation, of course, is a quote from the Buddha. So in the 30s, he's not publicly just saying Buddhism is the one answer. And then by the 50s, right, you get this kind of this tension. He's clearly committed to Buddhism. On the other hand, he pens riddles in Hinduism in the 40s and 50s, which is a treatise to the, quote, Hindu masses to try to convince them about certain things. He's not trying to convert them to Buddhism in that book, but he's trying to convince them to think differently about Hinduism and its potential. So even in the 50s, it's unclear that he's just given up totally on Hinduism as a religion. Definitely have rules. He wants to give up on that. But, he's putting more of his time on Buddhism. And back to your first question about Kabir, yeah, Kabir and Phule, these are incredibly important people for Ambedkar. But the question, is, and this is a challenge to other folks, we all need to tell part of the story. I want to buy a book on Ambedkar and his reception of Kabir, because I bought collections of Kabir's works. They're small and they're, in English, they're small. So it's tough for me to get access to Kabir's thoughts and how it might matter for Ambedkar. So I'm excited to see someone take up that torch and say that. What's the value of me having 2 lines on Kabir in a book on Dewey and Ambedkar? I don't know, not much. So this is the challenge, is I hear what you're saying, that, Kabir is surely important for Ambedkar. I just don't think my book needs to be, or can be, I don't think I can be the person to explain that value. Phule is another person that more people in the West have to understand as an important figure, as a hybrid figure, and is important to the West. And so this is one of the exciting things about some of the ways we can do work on Ambedkar. Some of it will help people who already want to study Ambedkar. Okay. Some of it will build bridges, right? And I'm hopeful my book is one of those bridge building books, in addition to just drilling into the historical facts behind the line in Zelia about Dewey was important. And so yes, people in America who know about pragmatism but don't know about Ambedkar, they can easily grab this and start teaching it, and then they can go deeper into Kabir, someone they never even dreamed of hearing or knowing about. So, and some other work that knows a lot more about Kabir than I. So this is kind of how I envision some of the values of these different projects.
Any more questions? Yes, Snehalata, go ahead.
Hello.
No.
Am I audible to?
Yes, I hear you. Jai Bhim.
Jai Bhim, Jai Bhim. Thank you, Professor Scott Stout, sir, and all those who have organized this Zoom meeting. It's really enhancing one for my knowledge, and it has guided me well. My question to you, sir, is as far as the history of civilizations in India, Dr. Ambedkar has very clearly defined it as it is the conflict between the ideologies of the Brahminism and Buddhism. And he focuses on the fact that many historians previously have ignored this angle. Today, since India has got independence, we are developing it as a democracy, and the democratic roots in India lies in the Buddhist civilizations. And the entire struggle, right from the Buddha to Kabir to Phule to Dr. Ambedkar, and even future to come. So, how do you see that this kind of pragmatism approach or reconstruction of society or the individual identity? I mean, he always emphasizes on, Dr. Ambedkar emphasized on empowerment and emancipation of an individual. While in other religion, since it is linked up with a divinity or something, so, so there itself lies the distinction that individual never thinks of himself and opportunities for himself to grow. So, how do you see the entire this approach of in India or from civilizational struggles and everything, right from Buddhism, then even in right from Buddhism to then Brahminism, and again in the Indian democracy, currently the things are going on in other way. So how do you see this kind of changes right from this pragmatism approach and all sorts of things?
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question.
Thank you, sir.
No worries. You're welcome. So yeah, this is one thing that I've always loved about pragmatism. And then, I see it in Ambedkar as well. The pragmatists tend to have a universal distrust of views of, theories capturing and exhausting what's the reality. So that's usually what philosophers think of when they think of truth, right? This is a true statement, and that's the world just, mirrors that. So pragmatists from Dewey and James all the way to Rorty, have complained that language in many cases is about a useful, connection to experience. So it helps us do things. It's gravity says this about your plane, and if your theory of gravity is right, your plane will actually fly. So, there's a kind of a predictive aspect to science and language use. It's not just, this is the way the world is in the mind of God. So Ambedkar, when he talks about history, you really get the feeling that he follows this kind of view, right? He even says, these kind of ancient historical, acts of hypotheses and testing, there's not much evidence. The evidence has been erased in some cases purposefully. So he says, you got to piece together these kind of more or less likely stories of where the Shudras came from, or the Untouchables came from, or Buddhist past, and revolution versus counter-revolution. So he, think about Ambedkar, what he's trying to do when he talks about the past is tell a useful story, useful in terms of what we know about the past and what we want in the future. So when he talks about Buddhism's past in India, in many ways he's talking about the future of Buddhism, he hopes, in India. So it's fascinating to think about history that way, as something that's really about the future of things like democracy. So your question about the contemporary challenges of India, other people are much better positioned than myself to talk about that. But I do see that there's a tension in Ambedkar. Ambedkar has this pluralist side that says, well, we need India to be, a nation welcoming of a variety of faiths. That's what pluralism means, is kind of the ability to have a variety of things be equal, even when there's a tension between them. And then there's also the side of Ambedkar in his last 7 years where he commits to proselytizing Buddhism. He wants conversion to Buddhism as an emancipatory act or a democratic act. So there's this tension in Ambedkar. Is India better served, if it has all these faiths in tension, or is India better served if everyone converts to his version of Buddhism? I think at the end of the day, Ambedkar is going to be more of a pluralist. He thinks that Buddhism has great advantages as a rational faith, but I'm sure he's a realist enough to say we're never going to convince everyone to convert to Buddhism. So this is a tension in Ambedkar, and like he himself would say, you don't worry about pushing the caravan all the way to the goal. Probably can't get to the goal. We'll push it forward. So yeah, living with that tension, I think is an interesting thing to think about with Ambedkar as a Buddhist. But a wonderful question. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Oh, Sangharsh, I miss the horns of India. The streets here in America are too quiet. I just heard the horn beep.
Let me ask another question. So
Sure.
you have used the word Navayana, and some people use word Neo-Buddhism. And how do you actually perceive these kinds of words attached to Buddhism?
Yeah, Navayana, new vehicle. As I understand it, Ambedkar used this only once, and it wasn't in print. It was at that press conference at the Sham Hotel before his conversion ceremony. And yeah, these words are useful, right? That's what we got to think about with words. Not like, is it the right word, but is it a useful word, or is it misleading? And I think, I like Navayana, even though Ambedkar didn't use it a lot. He talked about Buddhism. But I think it's useful because it shows, it highlights, it brings to the forefront some of the different things about his Buddhism. His Buddhism shares a lot of commonalities with this version of Hinayana, this version of Mahayana, but there are differences. And so if you want to emphasize those differences, use terms like Navayana as a shortcut to say there's something kind of different about this. And so I'm on board with using it. I think just to say, Ambedkar's Buddhism is just Buddhism. I mean, you have a point there. He wants to make connections to the Buddhist tradition. On the other hand, I think that encourages us to overlook some differences. For instance, the Four Noble Truths aren't there in as much highlighting as they are in other ways of telling the Buddhist story. Mindfulness or nirvana does not take a prominent role. Nirvana is mentioned about 3 or 4 times in Buddha and his Dhamma. So some of these terms that are really emphasized in other forms of Buddhism aren't as emphasized in Ambedkar. That's my reading of it. And so Navayana kind of tells us why, there's this, it flags that there's a difference here. If you want to go deeper into it, figure out that difference.
So any more questions?
Well, thank you all for bearing with on Sunday night. It's Sunday morning here. And thank you, Sangharsh, for scheduling this at a late time for India, because that allowed me not to have to get up before the sun rose.
Yeah.
Thank you, Scott, for writing this book. I really enjoyed the book. Yes, my way of reading and my question already, So this is just to engage with the text, with the idea, and philosopher, and we all are part of that. So this is such a fascinating book. I really enjoyed. I don't know how to learn and write a book like this.
Yeah.
So yes.
Well, thank you so much, Jadu, for your thoughts and for reading it. So that's I know it's a tough read.
Probably I'll write a review as well, so I need not to mention that. But
Hey,
definitely
that's
I will. Yes. So let's see how it will go.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and thank you all for attending this thing. This has been wonderful.
I mean, again, thank you on behalf of Speaking from Margin, to speak on such a topic. Vidya, do you want to?
No. Just to we are running late, so I just wanted to.
Yeah.
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 All right. Well, thank you all, and Jai Bhim.
Yeah.
So yeah. I mean, just to conclude, again, thank you, Jadu, and thank you, Dr. Scott, for this your wonderful presentation and Jadu's wonderful comment on Scott's book. And thank you, Speaking for Margin, and thank you, Vidya, for giving me this opportunity to moderate. Actually, so yeah, thank you,
All right. Thank you all.
thank you.
Jai Bhim.